Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, and welcome to the final lecture for the fall semester of CAPE. And thank you all here at Kendall for coming, and welcome to those of you who are joining us on Zoom and closed circuit TV, I think. Okay, thank you, everyone. Before I introduce today's speaker, my name is Lorraine Maxwell. I'm the Vice President of the Executive Board of CAPE, so I'm happy to be here with you today. Also, I want to extend a lot of thanks to those here at Kendall who have helped to make this happen. As some of you know, we transitioned from having all of our lectures on Zoom during COVID, and then we sort of tried to have some on campus as we had before COVID. That wasn't working quite well, so we're very grateful for all of you here at Kendall who have helped to make this happen. I extend a special thanks to Lisa Earle, the current president of CAPE, for helping to make that transition, and Cindy Robinson, who I don't see right now, but there she is in the back. Cindy has been the administrative person. I joined CAPE only in 2020 after retiring in 2019, but Cindy has been a rock for this organization for many years. And we're so grateful for all of the work that she does in terms of the logistics and just keeping us on top of so much information. So we're very grateful to her. And we also want to thank this afternoon, Christina Sharp, who is the current president of our lecture committee. Not president, chair of the lecture committee. Sorry about that. And she's going to be helping to field questions from Zoom. Later on, I'm going to be helping to field questions here at Kendall. So now, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Professor Sandra Greene. And before I tell you about all of her credentials, I just want to say really why it's a great pleasure is that Sandra and I are friends. And so it's really nice to be able to do this. We came to Ithaca about 30 years ago. She came, I think, about 6 months or so before I did. We're not in the same department or even the same college, but we met through other ways, through book groups that we've both been a part of, through our church, and through other work that we've done. We've traveled to the Adirondacks together, we've traveled to Canada together. So Sandra is truly a friend, and I'm very, very happy to be able to do this. But now for her professional credentials. So today, Sandra is the Stephen 59 and Madeline 60 Ann Binder Professor of African History. She's in the History Department here at Cornell. Her research interests have ranged widely over the past 40 years, from the study of gender and ethnic relations in West Africa to the role that religious beliefs, warfare, and the experience of slavery have played in the lives of individuals and communities in the 18th and 19th century in Ghana. Most recently, she has focused on constructing the biographies of both ordinary and extraordinary women and men from southeastern Ghana. She does so to bring life to their hopes and joys, their fears and concerns, at a time when both slavery and the slave trade were still aspects of daily life, and when colonialism was also altering how these individuals and so many others understood the world in which they lived. An integral aspect of her research has involved the exploration and expansion of the methodological tools that historians can use to uncover the histories of those time periods and areas of the world in which documentary sources are scarce. She has applied historical linguistic methodologies to the historical study of cultural change, collected and interpreted oral traditions and oral histories, and employed literary close reading techniques and contextual analyses, as well as insights from anthropology and psychology to extract the most from the limited sources that are available on the history of West Africa. She finds such a broad and inclusive approach both energizing and rewarding. Let us welcome Professor Sandra Greene.
Thank you, Lorraine, for the very nice introduction, and thank you for Kate for inviting me to share a bit of my research with you. Okay, so the title of the talk, as you can see, is Biography and the Challenge of Writing Contentious Histories. It's a topic that I think all of you have probably been somewhat aware of if you've been listening to the news in the last few years, as you've had a lot of controversy around what is taught in the schools. And you can see this in a variety of news media. In fact, this past Sunday, there was an interview on NPR with school principals and superintendents talking about how difficult it has become to manage the different views and ideas and concerns that currently are roiling the nation. And of course, part of this has a lot to do with the kind of political polarization that we're having right now. So what I want to begin with is starting with US history. The introduction, Lorraine's introduction, indicated that, of course, I'm not a US historian, but this kind of issue is not unique to the United States. I think it's particularly contentious one right now, and how you talk about history, and even how you talk about, what you say about specific individuals when you're writing biographies, but it's not unique. So I want to begin by looking at the United States and then moving on to my research to share with you, and I will be taking you on a journey. Linking what is happening to the United States with my own research and the kinds of issues that I've had to deal with, which also are contentious histories around writing biography. So I think it goes without saying that biographies are one of the most popular forms of history writing. Some even argue it's not history, but let's say that biographies are a form of history. They are written by journalists, they are written by literary scholars. I'm focusing on the ones that are specifically written by historians. What is interesting about biography, of course, is that it's a term that is so popular that people have begun to use it in all kinds of ways. So if you look at the traditional definition of biography, it's about the life of an individual. It could be the full life of an individual from birth to death. It could be a segment of that person's life. But in recent years, because it is such a popular form, the term itself has been kind of adopted by a variety of people. So for example, you can see in the PowerPoint that a couple of the kinds of books that are using biography, in a sense, the biography of cancer. Obviously, that's not an individual, but they decided that they wanted to use that term. You have the biography of Paris. There is a book that's a biography of New York. There's a biography of London. And there's the biography of the Civil Service Commission of Canada, So biography is a term that is very popular, and people are using it in whatever way they want to use it. I'm using it in my work, and in this talk, I'll be talking about biographies about specific individuals, And because I work specifically on slavery, I have been especially interested in looking at individuals both who were enslaved and their owners, and biographies of their owners. In the United States, there's a lot of this kind of work, right? So historiographies, you have films that are also biographical, documentaries, and you have many that are about both. Some of the formerly enslaved biographies that are particularly most popular in the United States are around Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth. These are ones about well-known figures, but also think about films like 12 Years a Slave, which was about a man by the name of Solomon Northup, who was kidnapped from Saratoga Springs. New York, and enslaved in the South. And so there's a lot of interest in slavery and trying to make these individuals' lives, you might say, understandable, relatable, so that you understand their hopes, fears, joys, concerns, etc. And these are some of the more well-known individuals that have been the subject of numerous biographical pieces. What you also have lots of biographies of slave owners, which is obviously the other side of one of the other sides of the institution of slavery. But that's where we enter into more difficult, contentious territory about the biography of slave owners. To just give one example, there are at least 10 book-length biographies of Thomas Jefferson, an individual who larger than life here. But until recently, little substantive had been said about his role as a slaveholder. Most of the early biographies focused on Jefferson as the primary author of the Declaration of Independence, as the third president of the United States, or his religious life. At least a couple of books examined his relationship with one of his slaves, 14-year-old Sally Hemings. But this relationship, in which he had 6 children with her, was basically dismissed in books with subtitles like The Sally Heming Myth and The Sally Heming Sex Scandal. Those books were written in 2001 and 2009. And many of these denials existed in spite of pretty convincing, almost overwhelming DNA evidence. One author, David Hyland, an attorney, and here you can see lots of people write biographies, not just historians. He says that this so-called fact, Jefferson's relationship with Sally Hemings, is nothing more than the accumulation of salacious rumors and irresponsible scholarship over the years, much of it inspired by political grudges, academic opportunism, and the trend of historical revisionism that seeks to drag the reputation of the founding fathers through the mud. So you can see there's a lot of emotion there. In contrast to these vehement denials of substantiated history, the quite respected historian Henry Wincheck published in 2013 his biography of Jefferson, Master of the Mountain, Thomas Jefferson and His Slaves. One reviewer of his book said, Wincheck brings into focus a side of Jefferson that Americans have largely failed or not cared to see. Efforts to not see, of course, have become especially prominent quite recently, which is what I began this talk with. In Texas, legislatures have introduced several bills, and one has actually passed that combines House Bill 3979 with Senate Bill 3, this is in Texas, that seeks to downplay references to slavery and anti-Mexican discrimination. So history has become a battleground. These bills passed into law on June 15th of last year cover a lot of territory, a lot more than issues around slavery and anti-Mexican discrimination. But central to its goal, this law, is to promote patriotic education. But in doing so, it could mean significantly downplaying certain well-known facts that would affect the biographical presentation of specific individuals. Omitted from Texas history books would be the fact, for example, that the celebrated and honored figures associated with the Alamo complex in San Antonio in the Texas Revolution were actually slave traders. That's never mentioned. You have the glory of the Alamo, right? It's never mentioned exactly all the aspects of who these individuals were. Those who led the Texas Revolution, a 6-month rebellion that ended in 1836 to free Texas from Mexican rule, was also an effort by specific individuals to maintain the existence of slavery. So part of the reason why they wanted to separate Texas from Mexico was because Mexico had actually abolished slavery 7 years earlier. And then the Texas Constitution was written to explicitly legalize slavery. Again, this is something that no one ever really talks about. I mean, have you ever heard about this and its relationship with Texas history? They failed to also mention that all of these settlers who were living in what it was then northern Mexican territory did so illegally. They didn't seek permission. They came into Mexican territory on their own. They took over land and they were essentially illegal immigrants. And the so-called and much heralded Texas Rangers individually and collectively were actively involved in a lot of extrajudicial killing, that is lynching, of people of Mexican descent. So you have, again, patriotic history that tends to ignore these elements of Texas history. And of course, this isn't unique to Texas. One of the bills introduced to the legislature sought to define all these individuals as heroes to be uncritically praised and emulated. This is what you get when you have, such contentious politics and an effort to kind of write history in a way that you want to see certain things, but you don't want to see other things. This is something that I found. And if you look at this Texas history, here you see 1835, the Texas Revolution, commonly referred to as the Texas War of Independence, was the military conflict, fact. 1836, establishment of the Republic of Texas. 1836 to 46, Mexico's refusal to recognize the Republic of Texas and its continued border dispute with the United States causes intermittent conflicts between the US and Texas. December 1845, the United States annexes Texas as the 28th state. This is just straight facts, fine. Then you have the war, 1864 to 1848. Sorry, that would be 68, not 1864 to 1868. Continued tensions between the US, Mexico lost to the US. As the nation rapidly acquired large amounts of real estate and spanned from sea to shining sea, slavery was placed on center stage as both houses debated its expansion into the new territories. The subject was settled in Texas because it had entered the Union as a slave state. But again, there's a whole element of the history of Texas that is never mentioned. The reason why they sought independence from Mexico was to keep slavery legal, because Mexico had already abolished slavery, but none of this is really mentioned. So I think it's important for us to kind of dig a little bit deeper to understand what is going on here and what is said and what is not said, what is in history textbooks and what is not in history textbooks. Texas legislatures, of course, are not alone in trying to hide certain facts. Other states have sought to censure the teaching of American history. As of October of last year, legislation has been introduced and enacted in 27 state legislatures, including in Iowa, Arkansas, Mississippi, Missouri, and South Dakota, to name a few, with the aim of discouraging or prohibiting the straightforward coverage of certain topics. And these topics include slavery. It includes the role of women. It includes, obviously, LGBTQ issues. So this is ongoing, as I mentioned, and I'm sure you're fully aware of it. The response by historians has been to strongly protest and denounce these bills. The two largest organizations of historians in the United States, the American Historical Association and the Organization of American Historians, have joined with 147 other organizations to, as they say, combat deliberate misinformation. Teachers in these states now say they have no idea what they can and cannot teach, and whether they will be prosecuted for teaching what is known fact about American history. This is what I'm talking about in terms of contentious histories. and the political debates that are roiling the schools, K through 12, and I can tell you that it's beginning to hit and has been moving forward to hit universities as well. So, and as I mentioned in my beginning remarks, superintendent of schools have been surveyed and they're finding extremely difficult to navigate these kinds of waters. So as the schools have become a more intense political battleground in the last few years, as I say, principals and school attendants find themselves facing angry parents, insisting that certain things have to be included or not included. But the controversies have not been confined to this sector of the political spectrum. On October 18th of this year, just 1.5 months ago, the New York City Council voted unanimously to remove a Thomas Jefferson statue from their chamber at City Hall. And I'll move this back to Thomas Jefferson. The objections voiced were that, yes, he was a founding father who helped create good, strong, and vibrant values for America, but he also enslaved 600 people and fathered 6 children with one of them, Sally Hemings. Because of this relationship, they described him as a rapist and a pedophile. So you can see the sides lining up, right? And of course, calling him a rapist and a pedophile is based on 20th and 21st century standards. We have to say that, right? Because in fact, in most societies during this particular period, girls were married shortly after they started their period, right? So whether they liked it or not. So you can see just in these examples how contentious the writing of biographies can be. What does one include? The fact that, he had sex with a 14-year-old? What does one ignore? What does one downplay? How much weight does one give to specific aspects of an individual's life, the episodes in an individual's life? This talk, however, is not about these particular rancorous developments. I just wanted to use that to set the stage. I'm not a historian of the United States. I'm not a historian of US slavery, gender relations, or immigration, but I am a historian. And I do write about a topic, slavery, that can be quite contentious no matter where slavery existed. And I've written biographies, both of the enslaved enslavers, both in West Africa, but not of the enslaved enslavers in the Americas. Still, this topic can be quite contentious in West Africa and elsewhere. I've been doing more and more work, for example, in understanding the way slavery is handled in North Africa and the Middle East. This also is a topic that no one wants to talk about. It's one that people just do not want to talk about. That's in North Africa and the Middle East. And it's only now that people are beginning to discuss the fact that this is an integral part of the history of those areas. But let me turn to my own research in West Africa. So my research has focused on the history of Ghana. There's a map of the continent. Ghana is in West Africa. Map is a bit small, but it's Nigeria. 2 countries over, you have Ghana. Ghana is larger than the state of Florida, about the size of Oregon. Has a population of about 32 million. Here's a bigger picture of Ghana. Togo, Benin, and then Nigeria, and then Cote d'Ivoire on the left to the west. So in the late 15th and 16th century, to give you a bit of a background to the history of this area, Ghana was actually a net importer of enslaved Africans, long before the Americas or even the US were even encountered by Europeans. Ghana was a net importer of enslaved people. The enslaved were bought by the Portuguese traders. Christopher Columbus was on one of the early voyages to West Africa before he sailed to the Americas. He sailed around the West African coast. The Portuguese traders bought prisoners of war from what is now Nigeria and sold them to buyers in what is now coastal Ghana. Prisoners of war were also captured in areas in northern Ghana around Tamale and north of that area, and exported south into what was a tropical forest zone in southern Ghana. And the reason why that was done is the tropical forests around the world are generally fairly sparsely populated. And that was certainly the case in southern Ghana. You have 90% humidity, constant rain. It's not exactly the greatest working environment. Still, workers were needed. Ghana had gold. And this is why the Portuguese were sailing around West Africa in the first place. Not only get to India, but to get to the sources of the gold that were coming out of West Africa, carried across the Sahara Desert and into eventually Europe. So they knew the gold, and they wanted to get the gold, and Ghana had gold. And African communities were particularly interested in expanding their mining of this gold, but labor was needed to access it, process it, and transport it to the coast to meet the European demand. And again, this was in the 15th century. So you have people who were prisoners of war in what is now Nigeria being sold to the Portuguese. The Portuguese put them on their ships, sold them, sailed over to what is now Ghana, and sold them there because of the demand for the labor to expand gold mining. And this was a demand that continued to increase in terms of labor from the late 15th century throughout the 16th, 17th, and 18th century, as other European powers also established trading posts on the coast of Ghana to purchase gold. Some of those European powers, Portugal, obviously, France, England, Denmark, the Netherlands, and Brandenburg, which was later part of Germany. I did work in the Danish archives because the Danes were there. Very few people know that. Very few Danes even know this. But they were there to buy gold. And eventually over time, as you have the export of gold shifted away from importing people to help with the gold mining, slaves, and it shifted to exporting people. And this shift had to do with what was going on within Ghana itself, a lot of warfare. So in the 18th century, for example, you have a major power that emerges, Asante. And they basically, it was an imperial power, an African power that expanded and waged a great deal of war, exercising control over much of what is now Ghana. But Asante was constantly at war nearly every other year. What are you going to do with those people, the prisoners that you have? And so what happens is that you've got this demand now from the Europeans who have since moved to the Americas, set up plantations, and they need labor. And so you begin to have an export of all of these prisoners of war, twice as many men as women, twice as many boys as girls to the Americas. Okay. And here is a list of the kinds of warfare that was constantly going on during this period. That's why you have so many individuals being exported. The vast majority were prisoners of war. Again, there was a war virtually every other year, as this imperial movement said they not only want to conquer, but people are rebelling. They don't want to be under people's control, Asante's control. And so there was a constant need to be constantly putting down rebellions against this imperial control. And that's what produced so many people. So more important for this talk is the fact that large numbers of enslaved Africans were not just exported, but were also retained within Ghana itself. Okay, so yes, during the 18th century, what is now Ghana was the largest exporter of human labor, enslaved human labor in all of Africa, the largest. But not everybody was exported. They were also retained, and to expand the population, expand production in this area. So slavery existed in Ghana long before the Americas and the US were even discovered, so-called discovered by Europeans, and it existed long after the United States technically abolished slavery. So slavery was an integral part of the economic system that existed in Ghana, and in fact, in many other African countries, just like it became an integral aspect of economic production in this country. What is important to recognize, however, is that slavery in the United States and slavery in what is now Ghana was not exactly the same thing. There were similarities. Slavery obviously was violent. In this case, you have similarities between slavery in the US and slavery in West Africa. Individuals were ripped from their families and communities. They were marched like cattle to slave markets. Mothers were sold from children, brothers from sisters. When purchased, they faced the possibility of being sold over and over again. The enslaved faced masters with unknown proclivities for cruelty and kindness. And it could be cruel. One incident that was discussed in a document that I encountered in my research talked about a slave owner who was enraged with a woman that he had bought. So he beat her and beat her and beat her till there were lots of cuts in her skin, leaving open wounds. And then he had his wife rub those wounds with hot pepper. She almost died. So slavery is cruel, brutal, but there were also differences. Slavery in Ghana, for one, was not racial. And that makes a big difference. The enslaved could hold the lowest position in society. They could also have high status in Ghana based on their association with the wealthy and the powerful. As in other parts of the pre-modern world, political leaders often made sure that their militaries, even their military leaders, were of slave origin. This ensured their loyalty, since they had no competing loyalties to any other families or political communities. They benefited from association with the wealthy, which ensured their loyalty. So it's one hand washes the other, although it did not ameliorate the social stigma associated with their slave origins. So someone could be the head of the entire military and be of slave origins in West Africa, and specifically in Ghana. That meant they had wealth, they had power, they had slaves that they owned themselves, but always it was remembered that they were of slave origin, which was a stigma. The enslaved, once they proved their loyalty to their masters, could engage in business on their own, and they could even become quite wealthy. Masters would allow this because they stated that let him, if he's got the skills, the entrepreneurial skills, let him make as much money as he wants, as long as he's loyal to me, because once he dies, it all comes to me anyway. I own him and I own whatever he makes. So there was a very different kind of calculus. But it must be recognized that very few of the enslaved in West Africa actually had any of these opportunities. They couldn't, they were associated, they were put out on some farm someplace. There were very few who had the opportunity to affiliate or be associated with the wealthy, be affiliated with the military. So most of them did not have that opportunity, but still it was a system that distinguishes it from the US system. That stigma, however, as I mentioned, remained. To this day, the stigma remains, and very few people are willing to talk about slavery, domestic slavery in Ghana, unlike in the United States. And I would say the reason for that difference has everything to do with the history of abolition in the United States and the history of abolition in Ghana. And of course, in the US, abolition came as a result of war, civil war to be specific. But obviously slavery didn't end with the Emancipation Proclamation. Slave owners in the United States were not prepared to abandon or repudiate a system that was based on racial slavery, a system that had made them a great deal of money. So supposed racial differences became the means to maintain both economic and social hierarchies grounded in the use of unfree labor after the end of slavery. I'm talking about sharecropping system, the convict lease system, racial discrimination in public transportation, in housing, in banking sector. So decades later, former slave owners and their supporters kept discussions about slavery central to American discourse by trying to whitewash what slavery was actually like. So you have movies like Gone with the Wind, you have movies like Birth of a Nation, and at the same time that people were saying, you know, slavery was wonderful, it was fine in these kinds of movies, the opponents of this kind of system, of this continued racial hierarchy that existed after the abolition of slavery, sought to emphasize how racialized slavery gave birth to systematic, unfair, unequal, and obviously a racist system. So as a result, you have discussions about slavery have remained in the public domain, right? On the one side, you're saying, oh, slavery was fine, you know, they had a good life, they didn't know how to take care of themselves. And on the other hand, it's like, it's terrible, you know, so you have movies like Harriet, 2019, 12 Years a Slave, that appeared in 2013, 13th, 2016, the movie 13th, and Glory, 1989. But the abolition of slavery in Ghana was different. It didn't come as a result of civil war. You didn't have slave owners and the formerly enslaved and their supporters, you know, continuing to fight about how we should think about this era in their history. Abolition in Ghana was very different. It came as a result of colonial rule. Britain gradually expanded its power over what is now Ghana by 1874, and it used that power to abolish slavery in 1874. This was not a homegrown movement. It was a homegrown movement in the US and in Europe. It was not a homegrown movement in Ghana. It was imposed from the outside. But it's important to recognize that even though Britain abolished slavery, it did little to actually enforce the law. They were too afraid of sparking an armed uprising, primarily by the slave owners. So it was only when the enslaved found out about the law that they then began to assert their rights to be free, to move about as they wished, to marry whom they liked, and to control what happened to their children. So there was no big broadcast that you are now free. No, the law was passed and then there was virtual silence. But colonial rule should be understood not only threatened the local system of slavery and basically abolished it, it stripped political communities of their rights to govern themselves as they saw fit. It altered the power and the roles played by political leaders. Colonialism saw the imposition of all kinds of taxes as colonial rulers sought to make Africans pay for the cost of the colonial rule that they never wanted over themselves in the first place. It was accompanied also by racism that denied Africans jobs, financial access to the banking system, equal treatment before the law. There are any number of studies that showed there was an African who was head of the entire West African medical service in West Africa for the colonies, and over time he was gradually moved out to be replaced by a Brit, a white Brit. And so these things were foremost in the minds of people as they were dealing with colonialism. Yes, the British colonized Ghana, they abolished slavery, but they did all these other things too. It divided, colonialism divided communities that were once one single political entity between imperial powers. So sometimes those dividing lines between French colonies and British colonies, one side of a town could suddenly find itself by rules and language policies imposed by Britain, and the other half of the town could be forced to adapt to a very different set of laws and language policies imposed by France. Okay, if we go back to the map of Ghana, for example, was colonized by Britain, Cote d'Ivoire, the French. Togo, originally colonized by Germany. Benin by the French, and Nigeria by the British. And you can see where the lines go. I worked in the area around just east of Lomé, and I knew of towns that were kind of absolutely divided. And it just creates havoc, in terms of some sense of common education system, common sets of laws. So in responding to all of these outrages, and there was a lot of segregation as well, slavery became something not to talk about. In the United States, people talked about it because there were still contentions on how to deal with this formerly enslaved population. What rights should they have? How should they be controlled? But in Ghana, that was not the case. Slavery became something not to talk about. It was deemed more important to establish unity in opposition to colonial rule, rather than addressing the social and economic inequities that lingered because of a domestic slave system. So opposition to colonial rule became the thing to talk about, and not the kind of divisions that existed within Ghana. So these lingering inequalities included limited access to land for former slaves, being barred from holding the most respected positions in one's community, restrictions on who one could and could not marry. This was all happening in Ghana based on if you have a slave descent, restrictions on where one could be buried upon one's death. If you are of slave descent, you can't be buried with a lot of other people, okay? With the so-called free. I've done studies on slavery in what is now Mali, which is north of Ghana. And in those areas, especially in the rural areas, up to very recent times, people of slave descent were not allowed, and this is a Muslim country, women were not allowed to wear a headscarf to show the depth of their faith. And they were excluded from any education, religious education. They could not participate in religious education, and they were forced to sit in the back of the mosque. So it's very interesting when you have a broader view to see how these kinds of issues play out. But this is not something that Ghanaians or anybody else wanted to talk to. Let me quickly move on and say, to talk about biography. So getting at biographies of individuals who were enslaved can be very difficult if no one wants to talk about it. That aspect. And getting the biography of enslavers, these slave owners, can also be very difficult if nobody wants to talk about it. And that continues to be the case. It can be very tough. In the United States, you have 6,000 slave narratives where you can actually reconstruct people's lives and what they experienced. In Ghana, I should say, in all of Africa, there are right now only 20 kinds of biographies. And this is given the size of the continent. So huge, which I don't, it's hard to capture. All of the United States, all of China, but in all of this, we only have 20 biographies. Nobody wants to talk about slavery. Okay. So let me quickly talk about my work, which was one of the first to actually talk about slave owners and to try to do some biographical sketches, So the one that I want to focus on is a man who was named Amagashi Apoku. He was a priest and a businessman who, by the time of British abolition of slavery in 1874, was a member of the inner circle of the political, economic, and religious elite in his community. He was well known, he was well respected, and wealthy. This is an old picture of him sitting there. He secured to collect taxes from Europeans trading in the area for the state. He delivered some of that revenue to the paramount chief, but he also kept some for himself. He then used these funds and connections to establish with the European traders. He established with the European traders to engage in business himself tasking some of his religious followers to help him as well. In this way, he became quite wealthy. But he was notorious for being violently opposing the abolition of slavery. So after the British colonial imposition of abolition, he moved some of his enslaved people out of the area that was controlled by Britain. He objected to even those who decided to return to their homes after the slavery trade. And these are people who weren't even people he owned. There were a group of people who said, okay, slavery is over. We found out that the British have abolished it. We're going home. We know where we came from. We're going home. None of them were his slaves. He sent a group of armed men to stop them with orders to either make them return or to kill them. And many were in fact killed. So he was a pretty violent man. The puzzle is why he was so adamantly opposed to the abolition when the vast majority of slave owners decided not to actively resist the abolition. What most slave owners did was say, okay, slavery is over. I still want you around. I still want you to be part of the workforce here. You are now a member of my family. You may be, they didn't say this, you may be a second class or third class member, but you're a member of the family. And then they passed laws so that if anybody said somebody was of slave descent, they could be sued for defamation. So they made all kinds of adjustments. He didn't, Amagashi didn't. What is interesting is that he had achieved his status after a lot of struggle, and he himself was of slave origin. He himself was of slave origin, but he had struggled. He had made it to the system. He had affiliated himself with some of the most powerful people. And the last thing he wanted to do was to see the entire system that he had managed to get up abolished and ended. And so Amagashi said, no way. What is interesting about my work, and here's a better picture of him, is that I decided I was going to publish about this man. And so I sent it off to a journal, and many of you know that you send a journal article off and they send it out to reviewers and you get comments. And so I saw the editor of the journal because I had been on their editorial board, and they said, we can't publish it. And he wouldn't tell me why, nor would he send me the readers' reports. Of course, I subsequently found out that there were very strong objections because no one wants to talk about slavery in Africa. No one wants to say this individual was a slave owner and that he was a very violent person and that he killed people who were trying to escape. So again, in the field of African history, there's a lot of sensitivity around how Africa is portrayed, right? And so you don't want to pile on the negative imagery around a continent that most people know nothing about, and what they do know about is often negative. Drought, slavery, drought, famine, starvation, military coups, etc. So I said, okay, fine. I know what's going on here. And so I said, I'll just incorporate it into my book, which is what I did, you know. And again, one of the reviewers had strong objections to it being published. So so what I'm trying to say is that these are contentious histories. In Ghana, nobody wants to talk about it. And certain individuals will try to stop you from talking about it and publishing about it. In the United States, it's far more contentious, because Ghana's still got other issues that they are more concerned about. But issues around race are at the heart of the difficulties that exist in this country and its history. And so what I want to emphasize is that Contentious histories are contentious. I mean, when you have people who are not agreeing on how to portray a particular history, who want to see certain things and don't want to see certain things, who want to talk about certain things in a particular way, but not talk about things in other ways, then it sets up a real battle. In this country, it's political. In Ghana, it's more, let's try to keep this under wraps. We don't want people arguing with each other, but it's all contentious history. And it leaves the historian with the task of trying to figure out, what do I include here? What do I say? What can I say? And how much emphasis do I put on it? And in a time when you've got Twitter and you've got TikTok and this and that, the amount of vitriol that can come your way when you are writing genuine history and wanting to put it all out there can be pretty intimidating, you know. So that is the current landscape that we are currently living in. It's not unique to the United States. I've had to deal with it on a much smaller scale when writing biographies of individuals who were of slave descent and who were less than wonderful people, you know. But this is where we are, and so thus contentious histories. I think the only thing that historians can do is put the information out there and let people deal with what we find. Thank you.